Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta. I'm your host. And this is episode number 5, Retirement Anxiety, the Good News. I can hear you asking, say what? And I don't blame you because I understand that anxiety and good news often don't get paired together. But I hope you'll consider that this can be so. Actually, my experience of 30 years as a psychotherapist convinced me. Anxiety has much to recommend it, and therefore retirement anxiety is good news. I'm not saying it's comfortable, I'm not saying it's something we enjoy, and we know it can be extremely disturbing. However, we need a new relationship with anxiety, not just to get away from it, which is our natural inclination. And the new relationship opens the path to amazing growth in retirement or older years, the second half of life, whichever way you look at it, that you might have been dreading, with anxiety as a part of that dread. So I'm talking to you about anxiety because anxiety comes with retirement, with the second half of life, because there's newness to that. We're coming from a phase of our life that we're very familiar with, had probably developed a large amount of competency in our career and so forth, and now we're facing something that we're not familiar with, that we may not feel particularly competent dealing with. And so I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that how well we handle retirement, the second half of life, our elder years, is going to be significantly contingent upon how well we learn to deal with and operate in the presence of anxiety. I'll take some time now to talk to you about how retirement anxiety is good news, and also the classic anxiety dilemma, because I want you to understand a very important concept that I believe the key to resolving our retirement problems, whatever they might be for each of us, is equal to resolving retirement anxiety. It's that important. So here's one of the big reasons that anxiety is good news. Because anxiety is alive. It has energy. It could even push us or force us into action. The problem is the action we usually opt for is to make it go away because it's uncomfortable, maybe even scary. And surely we're allowed to make it go away. I'm not asking people to spend their life in anxiety 24/7. But we can't make it go away prematurely. First, we have to experience our anxiety and work through it, very importantly, with support, not as a lone ranger. Otherwise, we risk short-circuiting the good that can come from it. And as you'll see shortly, we get caught in a classic push-pull. So more good news is that our retirement years are a fertile season for growth and for remaking meaning and purpose. Very different from the bad news our culture tells us about getting old. And unfortunately, change, even for the better, can seem risky. And that leaves us feeling anxious and vulnerable. So we begin to experience the classic push-pull, which reads generally like this. I'm not happy where I am, and I'm drawn to something better. And going for it, the better feels uncomfortable and risky. So I start to pull back to at least where I don't feel vulnerable where I am, even though it may not be a place that has a lot of appeal for me any longer. So I'm drawn to something good, something new, perhaps something exciting, offering possibilities. But also that takes me into unknown territory, unfamiliar territory. And we're wired for comfort, safety, familiarity, those things that make us feel solid and grounded and not at risk. So I imagine if you're in or around retirement years, and you're listening to this, you most likely have some degree of retirement anxiety, especially if you're pretty new at it right now. You might also be depressed, wondering what you'll do with your time. perhaps feeling lonely, anticipating no longer associating with people you've been with for a long time. But some more good news is that you don't need to address all your issues separately. If you address you, you'll be addressing any issue that you have, whether it's what will I do, who will I be, how will I have meaning or purpose in my life now. Any of those classic questions that we deal with as we anticipate retirement or we're in retirement, even well into it, they don't have to be solved separately. Because my point is, if we address ourselves and we address the need for change or whatever it takes in ourselves, that's going to cover a broad territory and can help to solve, any number of issues. So again, a change in you will help you to address any sort of situation that you may be dealing with or anticipate having to deal with. And one big helpful change is learning a relationship with anxiety that will help you to move ahead instead of stop you and make you retreat back to what feels safer, more familiar, less vulnerable. So here you might be. You're pondering, have pondered retirement, you're edging into it, wherever you are. And you also hear the comments of people you know, you hear the message from society that now you're on a downward slope. You're heading for unpleasant things like irrelevance, bad health, not being of any use anymore. Messages that definitely do not help us. And if we let them get too big a hold on us, they can be very detrimental and help us to start fitting into that unpleasant forecast that we're hearing. So some other good news is that you might not know it yet, hopefully you do, but retirement is like banquet tables loaded with life-enhancing opportunities. And whether your retirement years become feast or famine for you, or some gray area in between, will depend on your ability to change. And your ability to change will depend on your ability to move towards what you desire, even while feeling vulnerable or anxious. Retirement can be big change, big anxiety, but also big opportunity. You know it already, don't you? Retirement's a major change in many ways from what you've known, from what was familiar. And normally, except when abnormal has become normal, familiar equates to safe. Unfamiliar equates to risky, anxiety-producing. When you're entering retirement, you have every right to feel anxious. You're entering unfamiliar territory after years of knowing what you were doing. As I mentioned earlier, what you do with anxiety is going to be very important to how your retirement plays out. So can you, at least for now, entertain the notion that you're on the threshold of great opportunity, not disaster, if that's the way you've been feeling? I'm going to pause a moment for a brief infomercial, although it's more info than mercial, but I didn't know any other name to call it at the time. I want to let you know that early this month, it's January of 2023 as I'm speaking, I took down my website and the blog that was in it for reasons I won't bother going into now, but it seemed the right decision at the time. And I've been restructuring since then because the information I conveyed was both through the blog posts and podcast. So with this podcast number 5 and the next one or maybe 2, I'll be pulling in what was lost when I took down the website/blog. I've been trying to give you a frame or grounding in what the podcast and the second half of life are about, especially as it relates to retirement or second half of life or elder years, whatever way that is for you. And although my website is off the internet now, I do have sort of a mini website which comes from the company that hosts my podcast which consists of mainly an about page, which will tell a little more about me and a little more about the podcast, and also a contact form that I have through the podcast hosting company. Right now, the host company is having issues with the contact form and it's not working. But when they get it fixed, I'll let you know. And you'd be able to contact me with comments, questions, maybe suggestions for a topic you would like to have addressed. And then after that, you'll be able to access some additional information that I'll be putting out that will complement or supplement or expand on what was in the podcasts. For now, I'll say generally that my podcast exists, one, to counter the negative views our culture sends us about growing older, and also to provide important and sometimes little known information that is extremely helpful once you know it and can commit to implementing it, about what can transform your retirement or your elder years into what most of us would not be thinking was going to happen, as we get older. And one of the most important things I try to do with the podcast is to help you to turn information into transformation. Gosh knows we can get lots of information these days, but what we do with it becomes the important thing. So one of the main focus, perhaps the main focus of all this in my podcast, is to help people truly make significant change. It's also, which is required as we go into our retirement toward the roughly second half of life years. So I wanted to let you know that I'm going through a time of flux and restructuring. And when I'm done, then in the next, as I say, 1 or 2 or 3 podcasts, then I will continue to talk about the second half of life, retirement and so forth, and the possibilities, the very real possibilities in it. And with the ground now, a frame hopefully established, so you have some sort of an overall view to guide you, and you're not just getting snippets here and snippets there. Okay, let's go back to the podcast. Before I tell you the story, I'd like to give you some little hints or possibilities for focus. The second half of life is a lot about growing in awareness and being in touch with the inner you. It's natural for that inner you to get lost because we're so focused on doing in the first half of life and all the various doings that need to be done. And many times, as we're doing for others or paying attention to their growth, we lose out on or lose track of our own. So if you're in a location where you can let your mind clear of distractions for a few seconds, or if you're driving, it might be better to pay attention to the road, but perhaps you could revisit this at a time when you are able to be focused here and not on what you're doing. So you can maybe listen again when you have that opportunity, at least to the story. I would say to do your best to be present. Presence is very important, and I'll be visiting that a number of times along the way. But paying attention to what impacts you or how you're impacted as you listen to this true life story. What do you react to or do you connect with? What draws you or perhaps repels you? Any particular emotions that come up for you? And try to be aware, what am I doing or what did I do with what came up for me? One important reaction to be aware of is, did I dismiss the story almost as soon as it started? So I'll read these once again, and then after that, just let go of them. Let them be wherever they are, and bring as much presence as you can at this point while you listen to the story. So if you can, let your mind start to clear of distractions. Pay attention to what impacts you or how it impacts you. Pay attention to what you react to or connect with. How are you drawn or repelled by what you hear? Do any emotions come up for you? And be aware of what you're doing with what is coming up for you. And pay attention also, did I stay focused, or did I dismiss the whole process early into it? And now, here's the story. Well, I'm going to take some time now to tell you a retirement story about anxiety, and a true story, and with a happy ending. I hope it will bring to life for you some of the points I've been making about anxiety. It's a bit long, but I hope you'll hang with me for the whole thing, because it parallels, I think, what we face in nearly any growth situation. The following episode took place many years ago. I was a primary therapist doing treatment at a residential drug and alcohol treatment facility. And it occurred on a ropes course or adventure-based counseling course that was on the grounds of the facility. And the course is called adventure-based counseling because it was not just for the adventure. We used the adventure aspect to quickly put patients in touch with their issues that were troubling them and were needed healing. On this particular morning that I'm going to tell you about, we had a group of family members, some of our patients on the course. And one woman, I'll just call her Grace, that's not her real name, was the wife of a man who had been in my therapy group. And the element we were about to work on consisted of 2 vertical utility poles sunk into the ground, as working utility poles usually are. And a longer than average horizontal utility pole was lashed between them, about 30 feet or so above the ground. This was plenty high enough to concern anyone who had fear of height issues, a belay system notwithstanding. The belay system would hold them and get them safely to the ground if they fell. It did not, however, take away the perceived sense of danger. As Grace stood at the bottom of the pole, she was experiencing anxiety to the 10th power. She shook and cried and yelled that she couldn't do it. Tears were streaming down her face. It looked like there was no way she was going to part from terra firma. But then, patiently and gently, think support, the facilitator, I'll call him Bill, let her experience her terror. Then he asked her if she could put 1 foot up on the stepladder and stand there with 1 foot still on the ground. The stepladder was there to take her up higher on the pole, where there would be cleats like you see on telephone poles, where she would do the rest of the climbing. So when he asked her to do that, it increased her anxiety, but she did it. Then, with support and guidance from Bill, and this was backed up by a group of staff and other participants below her, Grace gradually reached the top of the ladder. Now she had to leave the ladder and transfer to the set of cleats or staples that I mentioned that had been driven into the pole. And the rest of the climb would be on them. Complicating the issue somewhat was Grace was significantly overweight, and she didn't have the agility a thinner person might have had. So again, she cried out that she couldn't do it. But she was beginning, whether she knew it or not, to develop a different relationship with anxiety. In the meantime, Bill continued to let her have her experience and just let the anxiety run through her, and then take in the support from below to get grounded, or at least as grounded as she could be, standing in 1 foot, on a small cleat, and then to climb up onto another cleat. And in time, she was standing on the horizontal pole with a bear hug around the pole she had just climbed. She was shaking, but she was beginning to be able to talk a little bit with the supporters below. And as I tell you this, many years after it occurred, I still feel a desire to just let out a cheer for her. Then, using the same slow, aware process, Bill gradually got her turned around and facing the other vertical pole, which was about 40 to 50 feet away. And now she was to walk that distance on a round utility pole, 30 or so feet in the air. And I can assure you that for Grace and for most people in that situation, leaving the safety of that pole to hang on to walk out into what feels like space, was a large challenge and takes most people a while to get moving on. And when Grace finally mustered the nerve to let go of the pole and start to move away from it, a spontaneous cheer went up from the staff and onlookers that were looking up at her from below. Initially, Bill encouraged her to use the belay rope to help to give her some steadiness. If the belayer tightened up on the rope, she could hold on to it and it would help her to keep her balance. And that helped her to get going and feel a little better anyhow. So Grace literally inched along the pole, shaking and crying. And then Bill had her stop and just stand there and do something else, which is very important, which is to experience her experience and for us to experience our experience. Everything that was moving through her, whether it was scary, unnerving, or not, to experience it, to just stand there and experience it. Not to move away from it, not to numb it out, not to blunt it somehow, but just to experience it. Part of the importance of that is that unlike a sheer adventure experience, which is mainly to do the kind of scary thing, the idea wasn't so much to reach the other side, it was to complete the inner task, not the task of moving across to the other vertical pole. And although Grace was certainly still scared, by now you could see she wanted to get to that other pole. She wanted to complete the task, so to speak. And then Bill asked her if she wanted more slack in the belay rope, so that she'd be doing the balancing pretty much all by herself. But he told her that she could grab it any time she needed to, and her belayer let out the slack in the rope, and she began to inch forward again, still tears streaming down her face, shaking all over. But when she reached that far pole, she was transformed. She left the first pole as maybe Laura in the Glass Menagerie, but she arrived at what formerly seemed probably impossibly far away as Wonder Woman. She was ecstatic. She was screaming, crying, singing, even threw in a little dance step. And she took in the people below who were all ecstatically celebrating her accomplishment. So Bill had one more decision for her to make. He said she could come down the pole on the cleats and ladder if she wished, but also she could let her belayer bring her down on the belay rope. That meant she would have to lean out away from the horizontal pole she was standing on until her weight pulled her off the pole, and she would fall a short distance until the belayer stopped her, and then be lowered gently to the ground. And believe it or not, she chose the belay rope. And so she was lowered into a circle of waiting, welcoming, celebrating arms. I unfortunately can't create for you the intensity of the experience for everyone, the Grace, the facilitator, her belayer, the staff, the other participants. How that just lived in a very alive way in everybody. So when she reached the ground, she was mobbed, staff, participants, everyone. And when the emotion settled somewhat, she spontaneously began to tell her story, which you might guess, as a child, she had always been discouraged from doing anything. From parents, whoever, you can't ride a bike, you'll just fall, you're too clumsy to skip rope, you'll break an ankle. All her imagined performance deficiencies were constantly laid out before her until she finally accepted them as true. and carried them into adult life and stopped seeing herself as capable of anything at all risky. So there was much more involved for her than just doing the physical action of climbing, walking across, and coming back down. That tapped her into a lifelong theme, an experience that had been with her, haunted her really, nearly all of her life. So you might ask me, didn't you say this was a story about retirement anxiety? Well, I think you can see that the issue is not really overcoming the fear of heights, but overcoming this long-established behavior of bailing out or not even trying in any anxiety-producing activity in order to feel safe and not vulnerable. I mean, she could just as easily have been experiencing retirement anxiety over something new and perhaps appealing but risky, such as retirement. In either case, she would have had to bear with the anxiety, hopefully with support, to reap the benefit of growing and changing. Whatever the seemingly risky situation, the pattern would have been the same. So, some key issues in retirement or the second half of life or in entering our elder years revolve around growth, change, the need for resilience. And as you'll hear many times, there is no growth without risk. Moving into the unknown or unfamiliar is always going to feel risky for just about everybody. But look at what Grace would have missed out on if she had opted out for safety. And before the facilitator even invited her to start up the pole, had taken off her climbing harness and then just comfortably watched the others from the ground for the rest of the day. So I think you can see we don't have to be at a high ropes course or on a cliff or a mountain to remove our climbing harness, so to speak. We can do it in various ways throughout our ordinary lives with the same result, that we unfortunately miss out on opportunities that might have turned out to be very good for us, but we never got ourselves to quite engage. Then there's more to Grace's story. Some weeks later, I received a letter from her in which she thanked me for the experience and said that her coworkers had been commenting to her on how changed she seemed to be. And she said they were right, and she wasn't planning to return to her old way, which she knew had crippled her path through life for a long time. James Hollis, Ph.D., a Jungian analyst, and he's a professor at Notre Dame, in his book, Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, says this, I'm quoting him: "All of us, even while functioning at a high level, will carry pockets of depression, for parts of our psychological nature will have been thwarted, remain unfed, unacknowledged, unloved." He continues, "Even when we bring these pockets of depression to consciousness, so often the way forward is fraught with anxiety as it takes us into new territory, asks more of us than ever before, and causes us to grow up by demanding full responsibility for how our lives turn out. But as we noted earlier, this anxiety must be chosen over depression, for it is developmental and depression is regressive." Listen carefully to this part. I continue the quote, "Anxiety is the price of the ticket to life. Intrapsychic depression is the byproduct of our refusal to come aboard." End quote. I believe his last thought is important enough to merit repeating, so I'll say it again. Dr. Hollis says, "Anxiety is the price of the ticket to life. Intrapsychic depression is the byproduct of our refusal to come aboard." And it's funny because when I finished reading that quote for the second time, it recalled to me how And I spent a lot of time on ropes courses or other adventure experiences. And I don't believe I ever saw anybody depressed on a high ropes course, for instance. I would be pretty sure Grace also had a fair amount of depression in addition to her anxiety. But she was not at all depressed going up to that pole, across the pole, and coming down again. She was alive. She was shaking and crying and going through a lot, but she was alive. And that is the price to aliveness, to vitality. Can seem kind of high to us, but I've seen it be so worthwhile for so many people. But as I said a few minutes ago, unfortunately, there's no growth without risk. It's going to cause us some discomfort and feeling of vulnerability. But if we can work our way through it with support, as Grace did in our real life situations, the reward can be a greatly enhanced life. Even, or perhaps most especially, in our elder years. So wherever you are on your own retirement path, I hope this has been useful to you in some way. I also hope you'll join Grace in the ranks of those people who took the risk and reap the rewards of anxiety-facing, life-enhancing change. I see that it's time to start winding down. I want to thank you for listening, and I invite you to tune in to podcast 6, which will be Retirement Solutions Digging Deeper. I'll give you that new website address also, retirementwithmeaning.com, where you will be able to view the About page and see a little bit more about me and about the podcast. And maybe, hopefully by then, the contact page will be up and running, and you can even use that to leave a comment or ask a question or suggest a topic you would like to have addressed. I'm going to close with a short quote that was actually on my website that I just took down. And it's part of my effort to give you messages that are supportive of the opportunities in the second half of life for a much more vital retirement in elder years than our culture predicts for us. So here it is. Nobody grows old merely by number of years. We grow old by deserting ideals. Years may wrinkle the skin, but to give up enthusiasm wrinkles the soul. Worry, doubt, distrust, fear, despair, these bow the heart and turn the spirit back to dust.